The Council tried to punish Earth. Instead, they triggered their own fall. The transmission came in at 3:14 station time, and nobody was asleep. I was standing at the observation window of Orbital Station Perseverance when every screen on the deck turned red. Not the soft amber of a routine alert. Red. The kind of red that meant someone somewhere had made a decision that could not be undone. Commander Yara Solis, that is my name, and I had spent 11 years in space watching humanity reach further than anyone thought possible. I had seen us build colonies on moons that were not supposed to be livable. I had watched engineers solve in 6 months what alien contractors said would take 30 years. I had even been present, 4 years ago, when Captain Leon Vance took the patrol ship Dorset into the Kepler corridor and made a choice that the Galactic Concord would never forgive. But nothing prepared me for the voice of Prefect Viceroy of the Theron, filling every human comm channel at once. It was not a request. It was not a warning. It was a verdict, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had never once considered the possibility of being wrong. The Galactic Concord, in session of full quorum, has found the Terran civilization guilty of unregulated belligerence, violation of Concord transit protocols, and the deliberate destruction of a registered Concord trade convoy in the Kepler system. Effective immediately, the Kepler quarantine is in force. All trade, transit, and communication between Concord member species and the Terran civilization is hereby suspended. No Concord member may render material, technological, or diplomatic aid to Earth or its colonies. This quarantine remains in force until the Terran civilization submits a formal instrument of compliance to Concord authority. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Lieutenant Dale Harris, who was 24 years old and had never once in his life been at a loss for words, said very quietly, "They just cut us off." "Yes," I said, "they did." I want to be honest about what the Kepler incident actually was, because the Concord version and the human version differ in ways that matter. The Concord said Captain Vance destroyed a trade convoy without provocation. What actually happened was that Vance received a distress signal from the freighter Helen's Run, a human-registered vessel that had been seized by Concord customs ships in a system that Earth had flagged as contested for 6 years. The Helen's Run had 17 crew aboard. Vance went in to get them out. The Concord customs ships opened fire first. Vance finished the fight. The Concord filed charges. Earth filed counter-charges. The Concord had more lawyers and more patience, and they had been waiting for an excuse. The Helen's Run gave them one. Prefect Viceroy had been the loudest voice for action. I had read his internal communications, obtained through channels I will not specify, and the language was not about justice or galactic law. It was about precedent. Humanity had been growing too fast, building too much, asking too many uncomfortable questions about why certain trade routes were restricted and why certain technologies were licensed only through Theron-controlled distributors. We were an irritant. A persistent, noisy, rapidly expanding irritant. The quarantine was meant to be a lesson. On the station, the next 4 hours were controlled chaos. People moved quickly and spoke in short sentences. The colony supply ships currently in transit had to be rerouted. The 3 alien trading partners who had been docked at Perseverance began, quietly and without looking anyone in the eye, to disconnect their umbilicals and prepare to leave. One of them, a Velith cargo master named something I could not pronounce, stopped at the airlock and looked at me for a long moment. He did not say anything. I think he was trying to. Then he went through the door, and that was the last time for years that a Concord-affiliated ship would dock at a human station voluntarily. Deputy Director Nora Lamb arrived on the deck at 500, hair still damp, tablet in hand. Nora was the kind of person who got calmer as situations got worse, which made her either the best possible person to have nearby or the most unsettling, depending on your temperament. "The Secretary General is convening an emergency session," she said. "You have been requested to attend via link. They want first-hand accounts from station commanders. What do they want to know? Whether we can survive it. I thought about that. I looked out the observation window at the stars, the same stars I had been looking at since I was 8 years old, and my father showed me the sky from a rooftop in a city that no longer looked the same as it did then, because humanity had spent the intervening years changing everything it touched. Tell them yes, I said. Nora raised an eyebrow. Tell them yes, I repeated, but tell them it is going to hurt first. It did hurt. I will not pretend otherwise. The first reports from the outer colonies came in within 72 hours of the quarantine declaration, and they were not good. The Felton Agricultural Station on Titan had been relying on 3 different Concord-sourced compounds to maintain its growing cycles. Without resupply, the projection was a 40% yield reduction within 1 growing season. Europa's deepwater manufacturing hub had 6 pieces of Concord-licensed equipment that required proprietary maintenance codes, and those codes were now inaccessible. The Ganymede shipyard, which had been in the middle of laying the keel for 2 new long-range vessels, had just lost access to the FTL core components it had ordered 9 months ago. Those components were sitting in a Concord customs depot somewhere, frozen. On Earth itself, things were quieter but no less serious. The communications network that connected human ships beyond 1 light-year relied heavily on the quantum relay infrastructure that the Concord had sold us, leased us, and carefully ensured we had never learned to replicate. Beyond 1 light-year, our signals would now travel at the speed of light. In practical terms, that meant our farthest colonies were now functionally deaf and mute. Captain Leon Vance, the man whose decision had in some way started all of this, was sitting in a hearing room in Geneva when the quarantine was announced. I know this because he told me later. He said the room went very quiet, and then the admiral presiding over his hearing said, "Well, that changes things," and adjourned the session. The hearing was never resumed. Nobody had the energy for it. What I remember most clearly from those first days is not the fear, though there was plenty of it. What I remember is a meeting on the second evening, attended by station commanders, colony directors, and a handful of engineers who had been flown in specifically because they were known for solving problems that were not supposed to have solutions. There were about 30 people in that room. I was the most senior officer present. I looked around at those 30 people. I saw exhaustion. I saw worry. But I also saw something else, something I have only ever seen in human faces, something I have never had a word for in any language but recognize instantly. It is the look people get when they have been told something cannot be done, and they have privately decided that the person telling them is wrong. "All right," I said, "let's talk about what we actually need versus what we have been buying." The meeting lasted 9 hours. Nobody left early. I want to tell you what Prefect Visorel was doing during those same 9 hours, because I found out later. He was attending a celebration. The senior Theron delegation had gathered for what their records called a successful resolution summit. There was food. There was music. There were speeches about the wisdom of decisive action and the importance of maintaining order in the galaxy. Visorel gave a speech himself. He described humanity as a civilization that had mistaken speed for strength and noise for power. He said the quarantine would last 18 months at most. He said we would come to the table and sign the compliance instrument, and after that, humanity would be a more manageable partner in the galactic community. His audience applauded. He genuinely believed it. That is the part that I find most remarkable looking back. It was not malice without calculation. Visorel had done the math. He had run the models. He had looked at our dependency on alien technology, our fractured governments, our noisy politics, and our relative youth as a spacefaring species, and he had concluded with what seemed like reasonable certainty that we would fold. He had made one error. He had studied what we bought. He had not studied what we did when we could not buy anything. 47 member species were watching. The Conquered was watching, and every one of them expected humanity to break. The Galactic Conquered had made 47 species afraid of them. They had made exactly one species angry. And that, as it turned out, was the only mistake that mattered. 18 months after the quarantine began, I was no longer on the station. They had reassigned me to Earth, which was either a promotion or a punishment depending on how you looked at it. My new title was Director of Colonial Resource Coordination, which was a formal way of saying I spent my days staring at spreadsheets that showed exactly how much trouble we were in, and then finding people who could make the trouble smaller. The trouble was real. I will not dress it up. The Felton Station yield reduction had hit 42%, worse than projected. 3 of the Conquered licensed manufacturing systems on Europa had gone dark because, without the proprietary codes, the maintenance routines could not complete their cycles. The Ganymede shipyard had gone quiet, exactly as predicted. And on Earth, the absence of the quantum relay network had created a communications delay that was, depending on who you asked, either a manageable inconvenience or an existential problem for colonial governance. Dale Harris, who had been transferred down with me and now served as my deputy, put it simply one morning over coffee that neither of us was enjoying. "We built our house on rented ground," he said, "and the landlord just changed the locks." He was right, and that was the problem and also, as it turned out, the solution, once people started looking at it the right way. The thing about necessity, the real thing, the thing that history books mention but never quite capture, is that it does not feel inspiring when you are living inside it. It feels like pressure. It feels like rooms full of tired people arguing about resource allocations and failure projections. It feels like bad coffee and long hours and the constant awareness that the options are narrowing. Inspiration is what you call it afterward, when things have worked out and you can see the shape of what happened. In the middle of it, it just feels like survival. But survival, it turned out, was something humans were extraordinarily good at. The Morrow Institute had been around for decades. It was a civilian research organization, modestly funded, staffed by scientists and engineers who liked difficult problems and tolerated bureaucracy about as well as most people tolerate dental work. They had always done good work, but they had always been underfunded because alien technology was cheaper than domestic development, and the Conquered made sure of it. If you could buy an FTL core from a Theron distributor for less than it cost to run 2 years of research, the budget argument tended to go in one direction. The quarantine ended that argument. Within 3 weeks of the quarantine declaration, the Morrow Institute received a funding authorization that was, in the words of Director Frank Adler, unprecedented, immediate, and frankly a little frightening in its implications. Adler was 61 years old, had spent his career being told his timelines were too ambitious, and had recently submitted a proposal for domestic FTL research that the previous budget committee had described as aspirational to the point of fantasy. The new budget committee told him to begin immediately. I met Adler for the first time 8 months into the quarantine, when the first results were coming in, and they were not what anyone had expected, by which I mean they were better. The domestic FTL algorithm the Morrow team had produced was not elegant. It was fuel-hungry, it required recalibration more often than the Conquered models, and the engineers described the ride quality as spirited, which was their way of saying the early test pilots came back looking slightly shaken. But it worked. It was theirs. No licenses, no proprietary codes, no dependency on a distribution network that could be switched off by a vote in a chamber 40 light-years away. Adler showed me the numbers in a small conference room in the Institute's main building. He was not a dramatic man. He just slid a single sheet across the table and watched my face. "This is our projected range in 12 months, he said. I looked at the numbers. I looked up at him. "This exceeds our pre-quarantine capability." "Yes," he said simply. The Conquered was selling us convenience, not capability. There is a difference. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Who else knows about this?" "Everyone here, nobody outside." "Keep it that way," I said, "for now." He nodded, and I could tell from his expression that he had already been thinking the same thing. The agricultural situation resolved in a way that still amazes me when I think about it. The Felton Station problem had been escalated to a team of 4 people, 2 agronomists, 1 chemist, and a 19-year-old intern named Pete Carlson, who had been hired 3 months before the quarantine, and had apparently not yet learned that certain problems were supposed to be unsolvable. Pete was the one who suggested they stop trying to replicate the conquered compounds and instead look at whether the growing conditions themselves could be adjusted to eliminate the dependency. The agronomists thought he was naive. The chemists thought it was worth modeling. 6 months later, Felton Station's yield projection had been revised upward, not to pre-quarantine levels, above them. Pete Carlson was offered a permanent position. He accepted, I am told, without any particular excitement, as though the outcome had been obvious all along. The political situation on Earth was more complicated but ultimately moved in the same direction. The Terran Compact ratification was not a quiet or comfortable process. The fragmented government structures that had defined human politics for generations did not dissolve gracefully. There were arguments that lasted weeks. There were delegations that walked out of sessions and had to be coaxed back. There was one memorable night when the drafting committee nearly collapsed entirely over a single clause about veto powers, and Nora Lamb spent 6 hours in a hallway talking 2 delegations back from the edge. But the quarantine had done something that centuries of diplomatic effort had failed to do. It had given every human government a common problem that was larger than any of their disagreements. And humans, whatever else might be said about them, are capable of remarkable things when the alternative is bad enough. I attended the signing of the Terran Compact in a large hall in a city I will not name, because the location is not the point. The point is the faces in that room. I have been in many important rooms over my career. I have seen decisions made that changed the direction of things, but I have never seen a room that felt the way that one did, like something that had been held apart for a very long time was finally, quietly, clicking into place. I did cry. I told you I would not apologize for it, and I will not. What I did not know at the time, what none of us knew, was that several hundred light-years away, Prefect Visorel was receiving a report from his observation teams. The report noted that compliance indicators remained below expected thresholds. It noted that human economic output had declined by a projected 18% over the quarantine period, which was accurate, but failed to note that the decline was almost entirely in sectors that had been dependent on alien supply chains, while domestically rooted sectors had grown. The report recommended patience. Visorel approved the recommendation. I think about that decision sometimes. I think about the gap between what the data showed and what he chose to see in it. He was looking for confirmation that his model was correct, and the data was almost close enough to give it to him, if you were not paying attention to the parts that did not fit. He was not paying attention to the parts that did not fit. The conquered observers watching from long range were filing similar reports. They saw activity. They saw construction. They noted, with mild concern, that certain manufacturing centers appeared to be expanding, but attributed this to resource consolidation in the face of scarcity, which was a reasonable interpretation if you did not know what was actually being manufactured. We were supposed to be suffocating. Instead, we were learning to breathe in vacuum. The moment I knew the balance had shifted was not a dramatic one. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Dale Harris walked into my office and set a single page on my desk. It was a preliminary capability assessment from the Ganymede shipyard, which had been quiet for so long that most people had stopped asking about it. I read the page. I read it again. They restarted, I said. They never fully stopped, Dale said. They were retooling. I looked at the numbers on the page. I thought about the Concord's enforcement fleet, which was still sitting somewhere beyond our sensor range, monitoring. I thought about Visoral's compliance deadline, which was coming up in 4 months. Schedule a full command review, I said, and make sure Adler's team is represented. Dale nodded. He was already moving toward the door when I called after him. Dale, what does the shipyard say about ride quality on the new drives? He paused. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. They say it is still spirited. Good, I said. We are going to need spirited. Here is what nobody tells you about ruling 47 civilizations. They all have their own problems, their own histories, their own long memories of old grievances, and the only thing that has ever kept them sitting in the same room together is the belief that the room is worth sitting in. Take away that belief, and the room starts to look different. It was 3 years into the quarantine, and I had a new title again. Director of Colonial Resource Coordination had given way to deputy head of the newly formed Terran Diplomatic Intelligence Division, which was a long name for a simple mission. If we were going to be isolated, we needed to understand the people isolating us, what they wanted, what they feared, who they owed favors to, and where the cracks were. The cracks were not hard to find. The Concord had been generating them for decades and calling them policy. My lead analyst was a man named Oliver Gray, who had spent 15 years as a trade economist before the quarantine and had an extraordinary ability to look at a financial data set and see the human, or alien, story inside it. Oliver had the kind of mind that found patterns the way other people find spare change, naturally, without effort, in the pockets of things that looked empty. He came to me one morning with a cluster of intercepts that our long-range listening stations had been quietly accumulating for 14 months. The Velith Consortium has missed 3 internal payment cycles, he said, setting the data in front of me. Not to outside creditors. Internal. They are not paying their own subsidiary operations on schedule. They are cash-constrained, I said. They are losing revenue they expected to have, he corrected. Revenue from human trade routes. They built those routes into their 5-year projections. The quarantine cut the projection in half and nobody told the accountants to revise the models. I looked at the numbers. Who else is in this position? Oliver slid over 3 more sheets. The Crest Collective, the Dune Republics, a smaller member called the Orath Assembly, whose name I barely recognized. These are the ones I can confirm, he said. There are likely 4 or 5 others. So the quarantine is hurting them too. The quarantine is inconveniencing the core members, he said carefully. It is hurting the peripheral ones. There is a difference. The Theran can absorb the loss. The Velith Consortium cannot, not indefinitely. I sat back. I thought about the room Visoral had built, the 47 species who sat in it and called it unity. I thought about how much of that unity was genuine and how much was just the accumulated weight of debt and dependency, and the knowledge that the Theran had a longer memory than everyone else. Oliver, I said, I want a complete map. Every member, their economic relationship to human trade, their internal disputes with other members, and anything they have ever said, on record or off, that suggests they are not entirely comfortable with how the Concord operates. Oliver nodded slowly. That is a lot of data. Take the time you need, but take less than you think. He was gone for 6 days. When he came back, the map was not a document. It was a room. He had covered 3 walls of the analysis center with connections and data points and notes in his small, precise handwriting, and it looked, at first glance, like something too complicated to read. But when you stood in the center of it and looked, the patterns resolved. The Concord was not the unified block it presented to the public. It was a hierarchy held together by carefully managed inequality. The core species, Theran, Vathai, and 3 others, controlled the major trade routes, the arbitration panels, the licensing frameworks. The peripheral members got access to those systems in exchange for votes and compliance. It was a system that worked as long as the peripheral members had no alternative. We had been part of that system. We had never quite fit into it, had always pushed too hard against its edges, and that was why Viceroral had found us intolerable. But our pushing had never mattered much, because we were new and small and needed the system. 3 years in, we needed it considerably less. And Oliver's map showed me something I had not fully understood before. We were not the only ones who had reasons to want the system to change. We were just the only ones who had been pushed far enough to say so out loud. The Crest Collective made the first move. It was not dramatic. It was a series of sublight communications, low bandwidth, the kind that moved slowly through space and could be plausibly attributed to navigational data or routine signal checks. But the content was not navigational. It was conversational. A Crest cultural liaison named something that sounded roughly like Echeron began exchanging messages with a xenolinguistics team based in our Antarctic research hub. And within 2 months, the exchanges had moved from cultural topics to something harder to categorize. They liked us. That was the strange, simple truth. The Crest had always been fascinated by humanity, by the speed of our change, the variety of our thinking, the strange emotional intensity that made us seem, to older species, simultaneously impressive and exhausting. The quarantine had not made them hostile. It had made them lonely. I authorized a careful, deniable expansion of those communications. I also authorized Oliver's team to make quiet, indirect contact with the Vathai hegemony, not through official channels, but through third-party networks that gave both sides the ability to claim nothing had happened if anyone asked. The Vathai response came back in 11 days. It was short. It said, "We are aware that certain structural matters may benefit from review. We note that the Terran civilization appears to share this awareness. We are open to further contact." I read that message 4 times. Then I called Nora Lamb, who had transitioned from deputy director to the Terran Compact's chief diplomatic officer, and I read it to her over a secure line. There was a long pause on her end. "They are not offering an alliance," she said finally. "No," I agreed. "They are opening a door." "There is a difference." "Yes, but doors are how you start." The Vathai hegemony and the Theran had been in a simmering dispute for 11 years over extraction rights in a system that sat at the edge of both their territories. It was the kind of dispute the conquered arbitration system was designed to manage, and for most of those 11 years it had managed it, which is to say it had kept both sides unhappy enough to stay at the table, but not so unhappy that anyone left. The Theran used the conquered arbitration process the way a skilled card player uses a table, not to resolve disputes but to extend them, to keep the other party committed to a process that the Theran had more experience navigating. Viceroral, elevated by the success of the Earth quarantine in the eyes of his own people, had grown bolder. 3 months before our contact with the Vathai, he had moved to press the Theran's advantage in the resource dispute rather than accept another round of arbitration. He had calculated that the Vathai would back down. The Vathai had not backed down. And now the Vathai were talking to us. I want to be clear about what happened next, because it is the point where some accounts make us sound cleverer than we were. We did not orchestrate what followed. We identified it and moved quickly when it appeared, which is different. There is no genius in seeing a door open. The genius, if there was any, was in understanding that walking through it carefully was more powerful than kicking it down. The Terran Compact's legal team had been working on a project for 6 months that we had not announced. It was a complete, annotated analysis of every documented conquered treaty violation over a century of human membership. Every instance where conquered rules had been applied selectively. Every case where arbitration had favored core members despite evidence pointing elsewhere. every licensing restriction that could not be justified by safety or technical grounds, and could only be explained by market protection. It was meticulous. It was accurate. Every citation was sourced. Oliver's team had cross-referenced it with economic data to show the downstream effects on peripheral member species. We did not send it to the Concord. We did not address it to Viceroy or the Theron or the arbitration panels. We broadcast it on open frequencies to every peripheral member species in the Concord's network. The response was not immediate. It took 3 days for the full picture to filter through. Then, one by one, the reactions began arriving at our long-range listening stations. Some were outrage. Some were denial. Some, from the smaller members, were something harder to name, the quiet specific sound of a suspicion that has finally been confirmed. The Crest Collective sent us a personal message through Echeron's channel. It said, in translation, "We have been reading your document. We have decided it is accurate. We would like to speak more directly." Viceroy's response to the broadcast was to issue a formal condemnation and to accuse humanity of deliberate destabilization of galactic order. His statement was precise and well-crafted and completely missed the point, because the audience for our document was not the Concord. It had never been the Concord. We had been quarantined from the galaxy. So we introduced the galaxy to itself. And the galaxy, it turned out, had quite a lot it wanted to discuss. Prefect Viceroy finally made a mistake that could not be walked back, and it was not a complicated mistake. It was the oldest mistake in the history of power. He looked at patience and called it weakness. Year 4 of the quarantine. The Concord had not broken us, and they knew it, and the knowledge had spread to places Viceroy would have preferred it not reach. The Crest Collective was openly defying full quarantine compliance. The Vothi back channel had become less of a back channel and more of a corridor. 3 peripheral member species had filed formal questions about arbitration procedure through the Concord's own legal system, citing the document broadcast as their basis. Viceroy needed to demonstrate control. So he did what powerful people do when they feel their grip loosening. He reached for something large and visible. The Concord enforcement fleet arrived at the edge of Terran space on a Thursday morning. I know it was Thursday because Dale Harris came into my office, set a coffee in front of me and said, 40 warships just dropped out of transit at the Kepler boundary. Theron flagged with Allied escorts. They are not broadcasting hostile intent. What are they broadcasting? Standard Concord supremacy language. They want negotiators. They are framing it as an opportunity for the Terran Compact to demonstrate its willingness to engage in good faith dialogue. I drank the coffee. It was better than it used to be. One of the small improvements of the quarantine years was that, without access to imported food compounds, human culinary development had taken a significant leap forward out of sheer necessity. I thought about this, briefly and irrelevantly, and then I said, "What is the current status of the Ganymede Fleet Group?" Dale looked at his tablet. Admiral Grace Hewitt reports all vessels are mission-capable. She is asking for orders. Grace Hewitt was 60 years old, had white hair she refused to cut, and had the calmest voice of anyone I had ever met in a high-pressure situation. She was the right person to command what we were about to send into that corridor. "Tell Admiral Hewitt to proceed to the Kepler boundary at standard transit," I said. "Full complement. Tell her to hold at the boundary line and to be visible. Do not approach. Do not broadcast hostile intent, but be visible." Dale was already composing the message. He paused. "They are going to be surprised," he said. "Yes," I said, "that is rather the point." What the Concord enforcement fleet encountered when the Terran group arrived at the Kepler boundary was not what they expected. They expected something diminished. They expected the battered remnant of a civilization that had been cut off from alien technology for 4 years, patched together from old parts and stubborn determination, functional enough to negotiate but clearly outmatched. Admiral Hewitt's fleet was not that. The new Terran vessels were not elegant. I will say that plainly. They did not have the smooth lines of Theran military design or the careful aesthetic that older spacefaring civilizations brought to their engineering. They looked like what they were, things built under pressure by people who had solved hard problems in a hurry and had not had time to worry about how the solutions looked from the outside. They were angular and dense and modular, with point defense arrays positioned in configurations that the Concorde's tactical analysts would later describe. In a classified assessment, I was never supposed to see as unusual but logical given a design philosophy oriented toward adversarial asymmetry, which was a formal way of saying our ships were built to fight enemies who were better equipped, not worse. The Concorde Fleet Admiral, a Theran officer whose name translates roughly as something like Commander of the Third Reach, looked at the sensor returns for a very long time. Then he sent a private, encrypted message to Prefect Viceroral that was intercepted by one of our listening stations within the week. The message was 12 lines long. The line that matters was this: "They are not the species we quarantined." On the station side of the boundary, Admiral Hewitt kept her fleet exactly where it was. She did not advance. She did not provoke. She answered the Concorde's communication requests politely and said, with the same measured calm she used for everything, that the Terran Compact was available for dialogue at the Compact's convenience and looked forward to a productive conversation. The Concorde fleet held position for 6 days. Then it withdrew to a staging area further back along the Kepler corridor. It was not a victory, not in any formal sense. No agreements were reached. No shots were fired. But something had shifted, and everyone on both sides of that boundary could feel it, the weight of a story that had started one way and was now moving in a different direction. I flew out to the fleet 2 days after the Concorde withdrawal to meet with Grace Hewitt in person. She was aboard her flagship, a vessel called the Aldwych, which was one of the early production models from Ganymede, and still had that quality of barely contained complexity that the newer ships were starting to smooth out. We sat in her planning room with coffee that was, by then, genuinely good, and talked for 3 hours about what came next. "They will not try that again soon," Grace said, meaning the fleet demonstration. "No," I agreed. But that was not really the point of it. The point was the other 46 species watching. Grace nodded. She had been thinking the same thing. Every species in the Concorde just watched us meet a Theran enforcement fleet and not back down. "And not fire," I added. "That is equally important. We are not the threat. The system is the threat. Those are different arguments." She looked at me. "You are already 3 steps ahead of this." Oliver Gray is 3 steps ahead of it. I am just trying to keep up with Oliver. She smiled. Grace Hewitt had one of those smiles that appeared rarely and meant something when they did. "What does Oliver say happens next?" "The petition," I said. 3 peripheral members have already filed with the Concorde's own legal system. The reforms they are asking for are modest on paper: independent arbitration, sunset clauses on economic sanctions, the right to bilateral trade outside Concorde frameworks. "Modest on paper," she repeated. "Hollow out everything that gives the Theran their structural advantages," I confirmed. The reforms petition was the piece I had been watching most carefully, because it was the piece Viceroral could least afford to ignore and least afford to allow. To refuse the petition was to break the Concorde's own charter openly, to admit publicly that the legal system the Concorde had built was only meant to work when the right people were asking the questions. To allow it was to permit a vote that might go badly wrong. He tried to delay it. Procedural objections, committee reviews, requests for additional documentation. It was masterful, actually. I say that without sarcasm. Viceroral was an extraordinarily skilled political operator, and his ability to use the Concorde's own procedures to slow things down was, in other circumstances, impressive. But Oliver's map had shown me something critical. The delays were costing him. Every week the petition sat in procedural limbo. The peripheral members who had signed it were talking to each other. They were comparing notes. They were looking at the document broadcast. They were looking at what the Crest Collective had done in openly breaking quarantine compliance and watching carefully to see what the consequences were. The consequences, at that moment, were less severe than the Theron had intended. Because the Crest Collective had been quietly trading with us for 2 years, their economy had quietly strengthened, and the sanctions Viceroy levied against them landed on a target that was more stable than expected. I was present via secure link when the Crest Collective's council received the formal sanction notice. Echerin had arranged the link. She translated in real time, which she did not need to do because we had our own translators, but I think she wanted us to hear the tone in the chamber, not just the words. The tone was not fear, it was calculation. And then, after a few moments of silence that stretched long enough to be significant, it was resolve. The Crest Collective issued a public statement the following day affirming their withdrawal from quarantine compliance on humanitarian grounds. They had prepared legal arguments citing the document broadcasts evidence of selective rule enforcement. The arguments were sound. Viceroy condemned it. 2 other peripheral members quietly indicated they were watching the situation with interest. The math was getting worse for the conquered, and everyone could see it. The Vathai hegemony formally seconded the reform petition in the 8th week of procedural delay. This was significant because the Vathai were not peripheral members. They were a founding species of the conquered. When they seconded the petition, it could no longer be treated as a complaint from the outer edges of the system. It was a complaint from within the core. Viceroy, in private communications we intercepted and decrypted over a period of 6 weeks, expressed something that the translator rendered as deep strategic concern. His advisors recommended a direct response to the Vathai, a private communication reminding them of the long history between Theron and Vathai, the mutual benefits of the existing structure, the risk of destabilization. The Vathai replied through their own channels with a phrase that translated roughly as, "We are aware of the history. It is one of our concerns." I was not in any of those conversations, but I was watching the sensor returns from the Kepler boundary, where the conquered fleet had maintained a reduced presence since the withdrawal. And I was watching Grace Hewitt's fleet, which had returned to Ganymede but was keeping itself ready. And I was watching the stars, the same stars, the ones I had been looking at since I was 8 years old. They had built a cage to break us. What they had actually built was a mirror. And the Concord's other members were getting their first good look at themselves inside it. I want to be precise about what happened, because history has a way of making things cleaner than they were. The Concord did not collapse the night the reform vote passed. It had been falling for 4 years. We just watched it hit the ground. Year 5. The Terran Compact and the Vathai hegemony concluded their bilateral trade and mutual defense discussions and announced the result publicly, through formal diplomatic channels, with full documentation of the legal basis. The agreement invoked a treaty clause that predated the quarantine statutes by 60 years, a clause that permitted independent bilateral arrangements between spacefaring civilizations under specific conditions that, it turned out, the current situation met precisely. It was legal, completely, verifiably, irritatingly legal. The Concord's legal office reviewed it for 3 weeks and came back with a conclusion that, based on the intercepted communications I read later, one of the Concord's own senior attorneys described as technically sound and deeply inconvenient. Viceroy issued a statement calling the agreement a violation of the spirit of Concord membership. He was not wrong about the spirit, but the Concord had never run on spirit. It had run on law, or at least the performance of law, and the performance had just encountered a situation where the law said the wrong thing. The reform petition vote was scheduled for the 6th week after the Vathai agreement was announced. I watched the preparation from the Terran Compact's observer post, a small facility we had established on a neutral station that the Conquered permitted because the reform petition process technically required member access to observers. It was the first time in 5 years that I was physically present in a Conquered-adjacent space. The station was not hostile exactly, but it had the quality of a place where everyone is aware of a tension that no one wants to be the first to name. Nora Lamb was with me. She had flown in from Earth and looked, as she always did, like she had slept well and thought clearly even when I knew from experience that neither was true. Viceroy will call in every favor he has, she said, on the morning of the vote. Yes, I said. He will get the vote defeated. Almost certainly, I said, but look at the margin. She looked at me steadily. You already know the margin. Oliver's projection puts it at 9 species voting for reform, 9 species that have never publicly opposed the Conquered before. Viceroy will win the vote and lose the Conquered in the same session. She was quiet for a moment. 9 is not a majority. 9 is not nothing either. 6 months ago the number was 2. The vote took 4 hours. Viceroy's procedural team was skillful. They pulled threads called debts, reminded smaller members of things that were left unstated but clearly understood. The reform petition failed. The margin was exactly what Oliver had projected. 9 species voted for reform. I watched the reactions in the chamber feed we were receiving. The 9 species that had voted yes were not celebrating. They were doing something quieter and more significant. They were looking at each other. They were nodding who else was in the category they now occupied. They were beginning, in the way that political shifts always begin, with the slow recognition that the map of alliances had changed. Viceroy gave a statement after the vote describing it as a reaffirmation of Conquered unity and wisdom. His voice was steady. His face was harder to read. I had spent 4 years learning to read Theran expressions, and what I saw behind the steadiness was something that looked, if I was interpreting correctly, like a man who has won a race and can see the next one already starting without him. He was not finished. He made one more move. The Crest Collective's humanitarian violation was, in Viceroy's framing, a direct challenge to Conquered enforcement authority. Leaving it unanswered was, his advisors told him, a signal of weakness he could not afford, especially after the reform vote had gone as close as it had. He authorized a secondary economic sanction package against the Crest Collective, larger than the first, and announced it publicly with language designed to demonstrate firmness. The Crest Collective had been trading with us for 2 years. Their economy was in better shape than anyone in the Conquered had been permitted to understand, because their economic reporting, under Conquered oversight, had been filtered through a process the document broadcast had identified as selectively applied. The sanctions landed. They did not produce the result Viceroy needed. The Crest Collective's public response was measured and precise. They cited their legal arguments. They cited their economic stability. They cited the document broadcast. And then they did something that I do not think Viceroy's advisors had modeled. They asked, publicly and formally, for the Conquered to audit its own enforcement record for the past 20 years, cross-referenced against the document broadcast citations. The request was, under the Conquered's own charter, procedurally valid. Viceroy could not simply refuse it without breaking procedure. He could delay it. He did delay it, but the request was now on the record, and the peripheral members who had been watching the Crest Collective absorb 2 rounds of sanctions without collapsing were doing very visible math. The second reform petition was filed 11 weeks after the first vote. It had more signatories. The Vathai hegemony was the lead signatory. The Crest Collective was second. 4 peripheral members who had voted against the first petition had switched. Oliver Gray, who rarely showed emotion in professional settings, came into my office the morning the second petition was filed and stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. 9 species the first time, I said. 14 this time, he said, and 2 of the 4 who switched were ones I had assessed as unlikely to move. What changed your assessment? The crest sanctions, he said. Everyone watched a founding Concord member publicly sanction a smaller member for pointing at accurate information. That is not a comfortable thing to watch if you are a smaller member yourself. I nodded. I thought about the 9 species in that first vote, sitting in the chamber looking at each other. I thought about the doors that had opened in the 4 years since the quarantine began, the Morrow Institute, the Ganymede Shipyard, Pete Carlson looking at a problem that was supposed to be unsolvable and deciding the premise was wrong. I thought about the hall where the Terran Compact was signed, and the faces of the people in it. The second reform vote was held 6 weeks after the petition was filed. Viceoral's team was working through the same playbook, calling the same favors, applying the same pressures. But the margin had shifted, and margins, when they shift past a certain point, develop a gravity of their own. The reform petition passed. The margin was not enormous. It was not a landslide, but it was unambiguous, and it was public, and it was the first time in the Concord's recorded history that a core-sponsored position had been defeated by a coalition vote. I watched the result come in from the Observer Post, with Nora beside me and Dale on a secure link from Ganymede and Oliver somewhere in the background running projections he no longer needed. The reforms were, on paper, moderate, independent arbitration panels, sunset clauses on economic sanctions, formal recognition of the right to bilateral trade arrangements outside Concord frameworks. On paper. In practice, they removed the 3 mechanisms through which the Theran and their 2 closest allies had maintained structural advantage over every other member of the Concord for 160 years. They did not destroy the Concord, but they changed what the Concord was. They turned it from a system built around managed inequality into something that might, given time and will, become what it had always claimed to be. Prefect Viceoral resigned 4 days after the vote. His parting statement, broadcast to all Concord members, was long and carefully written and contained, near the end, a passage in which he described humanity as having deliberately and cynically destabilized the galactic order for narrow self-interest. I was asked to respond officially as the Terran Compact's diplomatic representative. My actual title by that point was something longer and more formal, but the job was the same job it had always been. Say the true thing in the most effective way possible. I stood in the Concord's observer chamber, which was the first time a human representative had been permitted inside that building in 5 years, and the room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when many people are watching, and none of them quite know what comes next. I did not use notes. I had thought about what I wanted to say for a long time, and it came out plainly. I said that we had not set out to break anything. I said that when the quarantine was declared, the Terran Compact had one goal, which was to survive. We had worked and built and connected and shared, and when we shared our legal analysis with the rest of the Concord's members, it was not an act of aggression. It was an act of honesty. We had shown the galaxy something that was already there. I said that a structure which can only remain stable if one of its members is sufficiently diminished was never stable to begin with. We had not destabilized anything. We had shown where the instability lived. I said that every species in the Concord had watched what happened when a member grew too capable, too independent, too unwilling to accept the terms as given. Every species had just learned exactly what the Concord would do to them if they ever found themselves in our position. We had not taught that lesson. We had simply been the example through which it became visible. I said that we looked forward to participating in the Concord as members, in the full sense of the word, and that we were genuinely glad the conversation could now begin. The room was still quiet when I finished. Then from one part of it, There was a sound that took me a moment to identify because I had not expected it. It was the Crest Collective's version of applause. It sounds like rapid clicking, lower than you would expect, almost rhythmic. Echerin was looking directly at me from across the chamber, and all four of her amber eyes were fully open, which I had learned was an expression of something like warmth. I nodded to her. She clicked twice more, which she had told me was informal agreement. I walked out of the chamber into a corridor that led to an exterior dock, where a Terran shuttle was waiting. Nora was already there, standing near the docking arm with her tablet under her arm, and the look on her face that she had when something had gone the right way, and she was quietly not making a point of it. Before I reached her, the Crest Collective's ambassador stopped me. Not Echerin. The official ambassador, a senior figure whose name in translation came out closest to something like Elder Voice, though the title was more complex than that. He was tall, moved carefully, and had the patient quality of someone who had been watching galactic politics longer than most planets had been settled. He stopped in front of me and said, in careful, considered Terran language that he had clearly been practicing, "What do humans intend to do now?" It was a real question, not a challenge, not a test. He genuinely wanted to know. And the honest answer was that I did not know, not precisely. The quarantine was suspended pending review. The reforms would take time to implement. The bilateral agreement with the Vathai was in place. There was work ahead, the kind of long, slow, procedural work that does not make for exciting stories but is the actual shape of how things change. What I knew was that we would keep building. We would keep connecting. We would keep asking questions and solving problems, and doing the thing we had always done, which was to look at a situation that was supposed to be a ceiling and find out where the door was. I looked at the ambassador. I thought about the Morrow Institute and Pete Carlson's growing systems, and the Ganymede shipyard, and the Terran compact signing, and Grace Hewitt's steady voice over a calm line, and Dale Harris saying spirited, and Nora spending 6 hours in a hallway talking 2 delegations back from the edge, and the rooftop where my father showed me the stars when I was 8 years old. "We will do what we have always done," I said. "We will figure it out as we go." The ambassador looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something in his own language that the translator in my ear rendered after a short pause as, "We look forward to watching." I smiled. I went through the door. The shuttle lifted away from the station and turned toward the Kepler boundary, where 4 years ago the quarantine had begun and where now, if you looked at the sensor returns, you would see nothing unusual. Just open space and starlight and the ordinary quiet of a sector where the worst of something had passed. I sat by the window. The stars looked the same as they always had. They always looked the same, no matter what was happening beneath them, which I had always found either comforting or unsettling depending on the day. Today it was comforting. Dale's voice came over the internal comm. "Admiral Hewitt says welcome back. She also says the new drive calibration on the Aldwick is complete and ride quality is substantially improved." "How improved?" "She says the engineers are calling it smooth." I laughed. It surprised me, the sound of it in the small quiet of the shuttle cabin. Dale laughed too, a little on his end of the line. They had tried to show the galaxy that humanity could be broken. Instead, they had shown the galaxy that it could be changed. And once a species learns that, you can never unteach it. That is the thing Visorel never understood. He thought power was the ability to hold things in place. He built his whole career on keeping the map the same. He had the Concord, and the legal apparatus, and the enforcement fleet, and the trade routes, and the 47 members who sat in his room and called it unity. And we had the drive to keep going, even when the going was difficult. The willingness to be uncomfortable and still keep moving. The habit. Built over centuries of being the species that looked at every closed door and asked who decided it should be closed. You cannot sanction that. You cannot quarantine it. You cannot write a legal instrument that stops it because it is not a resource or a technology or a route on a map. It is just who we are. The stars stayed the same. The shuttle moved through them, smooth now, no longer spirited, and I watched them the way I had watched them since I was 8 years old, wondering what was out there. We were still wondering. We were just further out now than before. And we were not done.